What I'm going to do today is just go through just quickly on some of the summer mixes, multi-species crops, to give a bit of an idea. And the reason why, well, there's lots of reasons why. One of them, it's very beneficial to follow a winter mix with a summer one. Also, a summer mix, providing you get enough rainfall, can be really beneficial because it'll fill a summer feed gap. Most of the pasture species that you have in your area and in Victoria generally are winter species. So most people do run into a summer feed gap. Something that I haven't addressed I often talk about grasslands and pastures and how they function. I haven't done that in this talk, but what often happens is we get to about October and you get the first hot day in October and everyone is dreading it because they know that as soon as you get that first day that, late night, I say late 30 degrees, 37, 38, 40 degrees, you know that all of your feed is going to be gone. Now, the only reason it's gone is because those species that you have are all, well, C3s or cool season species that grow autumn, winter, spring. And it's really important to get some summer species in your pastures, and that's a longer term goal for everyone to aim for. But these summer multi-species mixes can start to move us in that direction. Why would we grow summer multi-species crops? Well, as I mentioned, to fill a summer feed gap, and the same thing that a winter species one, it will restore the soil ecosystem, and if we get the species correct in that mix, we can fix poor structured soil, and that's plough pans and all those problems. I talk a fair bit about fixing poor structured soil, and that's very important because until you get the soil structure right, or at least heading in the right direction, very little of, or very few of the other things can change. It's very difficult to get increases in carbon, for example, with poor structured soil, and increase in nutrient cycling, nutrient availability with poor structured soil. So it is important to fix our soils first, and we can do that with plants. We don't necessarily need to deep root to fix poor structured soils. So, and in conjunction with multi-species crops, I've written on that slide, what we do is layer a summer mix on top of the winter one. Like as you graze it out, you don't need to terminate it. It'll terminate itself, and ideally grazing it out. And the crops are generally sown about October, late October. Ground temperatures need to be suitable. Need to be about 16 degrees ground temperature to sow those summer crops. Potential problems, there are a few. Not enough soil moisture is one of the problems, and the usual ones: weeds, insect disease, nutrients. Not enough soil moisture is one of the bigger ones, and that happens most of us around Australia, including up here where I am. And that's mostly related to evaporation, hotter temperatures and evaporation. It's drying the soil out faster. Now, there's a few ways around that. Obviously, grow the species that are tolerant to hot, dry conditions. We need to select those ones that will grow at that time of the year. Maintain good ground cover, and over time, as you increase soil carbon, you will increase water holding capacity. Very important to reduce the risk of growing some of these summer ones with the right seed selection, and always think about low-cost seed in doing this. Some people, in relation to low-cost seed, have actually been successful, at least on a smaller scale, of just simply buying birdseed mix. most of those in those birdseed mixes are summer mix, like crop mixes actually. So weeds, the same things, same thing. Grow fast-growing plants for quick canopy closure, maintain ground cover, and you can get some weed control also with herbicides if that's what you want to do. I'll be addressing that more when we talk about the individual farms that I have in this talk. Now, in relation to weeds in your area for a summer crop, there's unlikely to be a lot of summer weeds, because as I said earlier, most of those weeds have shut down for the summer. It's too hot for them, so that you don't really have the same problem of weeds competing with the crop as you do in with a winter crop. So it may not be that much of a problem in your area. So again, as we have grow species to get better competition, more shading in the winter crops, we can do it in summer ones as well. And the two of the better ones for that are millet and forage sorghum, for example, and get the ground covered as quickly as possible. Can put some brassicas in there as well, but as I'm going to mention later, the main brassica that will grow through the summer, unless people are in the southern part of Victoria, no problem in Tasmania, but also that allelopathic effect from brassica species as well. But the main one to do that is actually radish. Radish seems to be able to handle those hotter conditions better than some of the others. If the weeds aren't going to affect the crop, we don't need to worry too much about weeds too much if it's not going to affect the crop, but usually they do. Again, you can have weed control with the herbicide if you want, if that's what you want to do, and I'll talk about some other options here shortly. Again, in-crop weed control, but with herbicide is almost impossible. So we need to either get good weed control first or grow crops that'll handle those weeds okay. Now, like some of the winter species, there's some summer ones are very good at cycling and scavenging nutrients. And sunflowers, surprisingly, are really good. They've got a taproot on them. They are really good at cycling nutrients. Sunflower and buckwheat will actually cycle phosphorus really well. Sunflower's been known to cycle and make available zinc as well. So we start to shift our thinking a bit and look at how plants can actually be a really positive thing in making nutrients available. Again, legumes in the mix are really beneficial. Main legumes for the summer ones are what have we got? Lab beans, which can be grown in your area, or what have we got? Cowpeas. They're the two main summer ones. These just, as I had with a winter mix, and all these I can make available to you as well, like this information. Millet is, and I'm going to go through these in more details. You've got a grass type plant like millet, sorghum, corn, those ones that will grow in the summer really well. Legumes, you've got a few: cowpea, labs, soybeans, sunhips, and other interesting ones which I'll talk about. Broadleaf things like sunflower and buckwheat, and then brassica as well. So there's a few options there. Just to go through some of these individually, millet is a really good base to or plant to base our mixes on. To start with, usually it's reasonably cost effective, as millet seed generally isn't too expensive. It's heat and drought tolerant, and it is pretty good stock feed. I grew a multi-species mix this last summer, which really didn't grow until it rained in January. I sat in the soil, and then I had weaner lambs on it, and they really nailed the millet. So yeah, I was surprised how well they did eat it. So it can be quite good feed. Forage sorghum. Sorghum needs to be grown on a bit better soil. So sometimes with lighter soils or soils that aren't functioning all that well, sorghum may not be as suitable. However, if you can grow sorghum, you'll produce a lot of feed off it. And some of you may have already seen that on some properties. Again, it's heat and drought tolerant, but and also very good weed control because it gets such quick canopy closure. Cowpeas, I really like cowpeas. They are very good feed. A legume, so they fix nitrogen as well. They've got tapirine on them as well, so it helps the soil a fair bit, or soil structure. Because they will flower, that they are also of benefit in attracting beneficial insects. And they also are tolerant of hot, dry conditions. So it's surprising how tough they are for a broadleaf type plant. Lab, I do know Lab will grow in Victoria. Some of the fellows around Benalla have grown over the years, have grown some Lab. But it is, if you're only going to put one legume in there, you're better off with cowpeas than Lab. For your area in Victoria. Certainly very good stock feed and really good fixer of nitrogen. Now, sun hemp is used a fair bit, especially in the US. It's been really slow to be adopted here in Australia. And I almost left this out, but mainly because seed was so hard to get, but it's getting a bit easier to get. I wouldn't rush in and put this in. If someone wanted to experiment a little bit with something new or different, you could certainly try it. It produces a huge amount of feed. It is a legume. It is very good stock feed. It produces a huge amount of biomass. So, as I said, don't rush in to put it in. If you could get some seed, fair enough. But the seed has been quite expensive, and this is all about keeping our costs as low as we can. Sunflowers are really quite a strange thing to put in a mix, yeah, and everyone will really think you're a total lunatic putting sunflowers in. But as I said earlier, they are deep-rooted and really good cyclers and miners of nutrients. So they are really good to put in there, and the rates are really low. You only need a kilo per hectare. Now, surprisingly, they are good stock feed, and cattle and sheep, they'll preferentially graze them, and once they start on, they'll just take all the flowers off. So good to include in a mix, even if it's only to give the neighbour something to talk about. So forage brassica, I mentioned before that the main ones, you can grow turnips. If you know you can grow turnips in your area, and some parts, when you get into, as I mentioned before, southern parts and the cooler parts of Victoria, turnips will grow through the summer, but so you need to just have a look at that. Tillage radish certainly can be put in there, and it's really good, as I mentioned in the first talk, about how it's really good for breaking up compacted soils, and it's good stock feed. The other benefits of something like radish and turnips, and again, it's the same thing as I mentioned before, is that they bring nutrients up from depth and they store them in their bulbs. The bulb is actually a nutrient storage vessel. And then if the animals don't pull them out of the ground, which they might do, when they graze them, the nutrients are then released back into the soil for a following crop or following pasture. So they can be they can be really useful or very, very valuable for doing for that. Buckwheat is something that's I like it. It will grow on really low phosphorus soils, which are from your soil test. They're the trend I've got. Most of those soils are low in phosphorus, so buckwheat it's really good in those low phosphorus soils, and it'll scavenge phosphorus and cycle phosphorus. Good at weed suppressing, good at insect attracting. Now, some of the cropping fellows, which none of you are, see it as a bit of a problem. It can end up a weed in following crops, but I wouldn't worry too much about that in your situation. So, and as I mentioned before, it's really about having plants to fix soil structure. Regeneration, sunflowers are really good in there. Just some species mixes for summer crops, summer multi-species crops. Got some here, not as many as before. I mean, you can keep this really simple, and always remember to try and keep your costs low. As you include more species in a mix, the costs can get up a bit, but what we tend to do is then cut the rates down of each one. So you can still get diversity in there, but try and keep the costs low. Now, again, millet, lab, cowpeas, all those are really good, and got a question mark against turnip there. So that's a relatively simple mix. And if you want a really simple mix, something that I mean, you won't get quite the soil health benefits, but just millet and cowpeas together do work well. Not quite as I said, not quite the soil health benefits as some of these other mixes. Here's one which is a bit more complex, extremely good grazing to this one.
Sorry, there's a couple of questions just around the varieties and the rainfall for those species. So one question about 500 mil rainfall or less. Are those varieties and species suitable for that sort of rainfall zone?
Yes, they will. They're fine. There's not a problem there. They'll grow up here in my area, which the summers are a bit hot, and but yeah, they're all pretty tough. Those ones. You obviously need enough rain to get them up, which is a little bit of a risk, which is why I keep saying to try and keep the cost of seed as low as possible, or the cost of growing this crop as low as possible. So yes, 500 mil is fine. In those, like especially cowpea, millet, those ones. Buckwheat may need, you may not be able to grow buckwheat in those environments. It likes a little bit cooler, so you may leave that one out if in those lower rainfall areas. Question about does sun hemp? Sun hemp is it would need a reasonable amount of water, but it'd be okay. Like I'll use an example on some of the stuff Dean sent me before, and having almost a failure in a crop. Now, often when we only grow a small plant, and especially in an area we're trying to fix, it's generally not a failure in regard to that. Okay, you may not produce a lot of feed off it, but it's doing a lot of good in the soil. So don't worry too much, especially first year, providing your costs are low, if it doesn't seem to be an extra good crop, because it'll still be doing a lot of good for your soil. Okay, Dean, what was your question, Dave?
Yeah, my question is, and you touched on it before, last year you put in a summer crop and the rain didn't come, but it just stayed there until the rain came in January or February, and then it took off. Yep. Is that a strategy we could adopt as well? So when, say, October or thereabouts, we put in the summer crop and just it'll sit there till the moisture arrives?
You could. It could. It is a little bit risky to doing that, and I'll give you an example. This was the summer crop. I grew a multi-species crop last year, and I sowed it dry, a multi-species winter crop. Sowed it dry, and I sowed that in about the middle of March, and a winter one, and then waited for rain, which didn't come at all. We had the driest year everywhere. We didn't get rain through the winter, and that crop didn't even come up. Some of it eventually came up in about October, but then it was too late for those species. So it can be risky, but because that was pasture crop, it was sown into dormant native grasses. Those grasses were absolutely magnificent when it did rain in summer. It really helped those grasses. So if we keep our risks low, and that's one of the advantages of pasture cropping, is that you never ever lose your pastures. You'll always keep them there. So yeah, just a couple of things there. The summer ones are riskier than the winter ones, there's no doubt. But in regard to that, yes, you certainly can do that. Sow it dry if you want, and yeah, see what happens. Now I was looking for some actual gross margins of multi-species crops, and they're really difficult to find any, which is why I'm involved in, and I've got some data on this in a minute, or information. I'm involved in a Landcare/MELA project this year here, so comparing a multi-species crop to a single species forage crop. Now, this one is an oat crop done in Western Australia, and I just pull these figures out of actuals that they recorded. Now, and the approximate cost of sowing this crop was $250 a hectare. Now, they ran 350 kilogram heifers on it. And the cattle were grazing at 2 head per hectare for 3 months on the crop. And they put on 1 kilo a day on the crop. In other words, they put on that's for 3 months, 90 days. So that was 180 kilos per hectare, which worked out to be $720 on that. That's what cattle are worth now, as in today. If that's what you produced on paddock now, just by putting weight on young animals. On the pasture, they compared it to just pasture, and it's a little bit up in the air. You don't know how good this pasture was or anything. So, but they put on a little bit more than 0.5 kilo per head per day on that pasture, and that was 114 kilos per hectare, or 465. Minus the cropping cost, that was a profit of $470 per hectare on that, and that was only an oat crop. It was not a multi-species crop. So, and we sort of know this. We've grown crops for a long time to graze, so we know that they can be quite profitable. And one of the advantages of that is that you can be spelling other paddocks while the animals are grazing the crop. There's a lot of advantages, but there are advantages in it. Now, the additional advantage of a multi-species crop compared to a single crop, as well as that, what was in that previous slide, improvement in the animal health, and that definitely shows up in a multi-species crop. Soil structure improvement, nutrient cycling improvement, and then better water infiltration, can get insect control, and the improvement in the soil is quite dramatic in a multi-species crop compared to a single one. So there are additional advantages, and there is no doubt that there is extra grazing than a single species crop as well. So I just thought I'd put that bit of information there, and just to give you something to think about with that. This is the crop that we sowed this year in this MELA Landcare trial, and it is to find out the benefits of a multi-species crop. This was sown and this is the actual crop sown in March, and what we're going to do is split a mob of weaner merino lambs, and these will be grazed probably the middle of May. We'll start to graze. We're going to split the mob in half, graze half of them on a barley crop and half on a multi-species crop. Now, and I've just got the price, today's price of growing this crop, what it actually costs. There's 50 kilos of barley per hectare, which is on today's figures is about $100 a hectare. Grain prices are very expensive at the moment because of the dry seasons we've had. Now, as you can see there in the multi-species mix, barley was cut down to 30 kilos per hectare, and we've got the prices there. There was 2 kilos of Winfred, which is forage brassica, 2 kilos of radish, 1 kilo of turnip, field pea at 10 kilos, and favour bean at 10 kilos. Favour bean is not a good stock feed. Sometimes they won't even eat it, but I like it in there because it's a big plant, a big root system in there, and the soil health benefits. I haven't suggested any favour bean to in any of the mixes I've got recommended for you, mostly because favour bean is a great big seed. You can't, it's very difficult to get it through a normal seed drill, but it will go through my air seeder. So I just put it in there for a bit more diversity. I was going to put more species in there than that, but we're struggling to get seed this year. I was going to put, what was I going to put in? Vetch and lupins as well, but couldn't get them. So the seed costs are obviously dearer in that mix compared to the single species barley.
Colin, that's a great photo.
Yeah, that's a guy.
Valuable information.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you prepared the soil for this to grow that.
Oh, okay. It was very dry when we I guess we didn't get any rain until into January. I mean, any rain. So there wasn't the amount of native grasses on it that there normally is. But we got a bit of rain and it greened up, and then grazed it with a big mob of sheep, which I always like to do. Like, even though there wasn't the bulk of feed there that there normally would be, I still grazed it. I wanted to get manure and urine on those paddocks to help the soil health and nutrient cycling. That particular paddock, I did spray it with a mix of some Basta, which is a desiccant type herbicide. So that's all it had. It didn't have anything else other than that, and it won't have any other herbicides put on it, and I never do put any other herbicides on it. Sometimes I don't use any at all. It had 50 kilos of conventional starter phos, or whatever they call it, which is phosphorus, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Just a standard fertilizer. Restoring a tired paddock. I think, Dean, you may have suggested this, because many of the paddocks that we see around Australia and other countries as well, they're often described as tired and unproductive paddocks. Most of them dominated by weeds, poor soil structure weeds, and they do lack soil nutrients, but it's not so much that. They lack nutrient cycling. Often we misinterpret, I think, and we're told this anyway by people selling fertilisers, that the soils are lacking nutrients. They often aren't lacking nutrients. The nutrients aren't cycling. And part of what we can do with some of these multi-species mixes is get nutrient cycling and going. And that's part of restoring the soil ecosystem. Now, the usual methods of fixing or restoring a tired paddock, we see them everywhere. They're just short, often weedy paddocks and not growing much feed, unproductive. The usual methods is applying fertiliser. It's the first thing they'll tell you to do, put fertiliser on it. Then they'll say to re-sow the paddock, and that means killing everything in the paddock, either ploughing it or spraying it with a herbicide, and then re-sow it with with a whole big new mix of species. Kill the weeds on it, if annual weeds and deep river. They're the main reasons why. Now they can work, but I suggest there's probably some better ways of doing that. So what causes it? I mean, to be able to fix a tired, worn-out paddock, what fixes it? Usually set stop grazing over a long period of time. And sets, I'm going to talk a bit more about set stop grazing and what happens with plants here in a minute. Ploughing and cultivating is very detrimental. It causes soils to slump and lose soil structure. And soil structure is a serious problem in poor soil structure. It is not lack of fertiliser that causes a worn-out paddock. Usually there's plenty of nutrients in there. It's a bit like a headache. Like a headache isn't caused by a lack of Panadol. But we seem to think a tired, worn-out paddock is caused by lack of fertiliser. A very, very similar way of looking at things. Now, if we're looking at grazing management, and I realise this project is about growing a multi-species mix, but we need to get our places functioning well, and grazing management is a major part of the problem. So, in other words, if we fix a paddock with some of these mixes, and then we graze it as we always have, it'll go back to how it was. Once we fix it, we should be able to keep it there and continually move that paddock forward. So, poor grazing management or set stop grazing creates short root growth, unproductive leaf growth, and unhealthy, badly structured, nutrient depleted soil. Now, plants require time to recover before they're regrazed. Constant grazing will kill perennial plants. Short plants produce no litter. Short plants produce short root systems. Short plants produce have poor water use efficiency, and short plants cycle very few nutrients, and they don't produce much stock feed. Go back to this slide. These photos were put together quite a few years ago by Christine Jones. Same species, doesn't matter what the species, they're a perennial plant. Nuts are native, it's on the stipes. Now, the one on the left, poor little thing there, it's just been continually grazed. The one on the right has been let recover. Most of our pastures look like the one on the left. Now, and that's caused by constant grazing. Now, if you just look at that poor little plant and ask the question is, we'll start with how many stock you're going to feed on that. Well, very few. Now, and if we look at a few other things, how much water can that plant access? Hardly any, because it's only got a little short root system. How much nutrients can it access? Hardly any, because little short root system. Now, one of the things that happens with a plant, as we let the top grow higher, and we do that with rest periods, it'll grow a bigger root system. The top of a plant and the roots of a plant will be around about the same, and you can see that in those three examples. If you've got a little short a plant with short leaves on it, it'll have short roots on it. And it becomes really quite that simple. So if we go on further, plants allowed to recover from grazing will produce a lot of litter, a lot of ground cover. They'll have big root systems, have good water use efficiency, and cycle a lot of nutrients and produce more stock feed. And it is that simple. That's why that form of grazing really works well. Any form of grazing that will give you plant recovery time, plant rest time, will start to restore your farm. There's no doubt about that. So I thought it was important to include that bit on grazing in there. So how do we fix a poor, worn-out paddock? Change the grazing, as I mentioned. We can fix it by pasture cropping as well. A combination of those two, that's really what I've done here on this place. We can fix it with either of those two. I'm not going to go into more detail than that in this talk here, but that we know both of those methods, or better than that. Combination of those methods works very, very well. So we're going to move on to the three properties that I've got here. Kerry and Grant Connolly, I presume that's how you pronounce the last name. Now, this is just a photo of the property. Now, these are some of the problems on the place. It had in the soils low phosphate, high magnesium, high sodium, iron, and low soil carbon. Has predominant annual grass and very few perennials. However, I think there's more perennials on this property than we think, and I'll show you that in a minute. Weeds, annual weeds are barley grass, cape weed, dock thistles. Perennial weed is needle grass. Now, in regard to weeds on this particular place, I would not worry too much about those annual weeds. We can fix them easily. However, needle grass is a different story. Any perennial weeds are a serious problem and need to be jumped on really quickly. Don't take perennial weeds too lightly, and on the opposite, don't worry about annuals. Now, I realise from the information I received that Kerry and Grant are wanting to be organic and don't want to use like obviously herbicides, but that needle grass apparently, from what you've said in your email, is not. It's only a small area at the moment. I would bite the bullet and control that, and the best way is to get into it with a herbicide. I mean, just in that little area. Don't muck around with it. You'll have needle grass all over your whole property, especially if it's only a little area at the moment. Probably legally you're supposed to control it as well. So now, in regard to these are other photos, and it was great. There was a lot more photos than this, but I selected some out of here. Now, in the right-hand side one would be mostly barley grass, the dry grass in there. The bottom left-hand corner is I think is microlina, fairly short, which is really pleasing to see. And there's probably a fair bit of microlina through the property. On the top left-hand corner, I suspect that there's a lot of phalaris in there, probably some cocksfoot, and there may be a bit of foggrass in there too, which is not so good. But like I said, there's probably and the reason why it's important to know what's on your property is that they're the ones we need to encourage. Some of those better perennials are the ones we need to encourage. I'll just wait a bit till this slide comes up before I start talking because of the delay. Okay, I've got some management suggestions here, and remembering that wanting to be organic. So I would certainly, you mentioned in your email that you're wanting to have a rotation, but I would definitely have a rotation over the whole farm. Remember that the rotation is really designed to create time for the perennial grasses to recover. The annual grasses, don't worry too much about them, but we need to give time for the perennial grasses to recover. Which is probably just about giving you enough information to be dangerous to yourself. But we can talk more about different types of grazings later at some time anyway. So now, in these management suggestions, so a winter multi-species crop in the area that you want to do your trial on, I would look seriously at sowing a summer multi-species crop and also obviously we're grazing those as well, so you're generating a good grazing off them, but generating an income off them as well. Now, to fix those paddocks and move them forward, you could really think about repeating the summer and winter mixes for the second year. What I've found is that generally 2 years in a row with those mixes will move those paddocks forward and start to fix the soil. Now, you mentioned also an email that you wanted to increase the perennials the perennial diversity, which is a really good thing. Now here we've got add. We can add summer and winter perennial pasture species, but the main ones that are missing from your property, I'd suggest, are summer species, and they can be chicory, plantain, lucerne. That's very standard ones, but they're winter growers. Plantain will grow through the autumn and winter as well. Now, some summer grasses, like as you can see for warm season grasses, digit grass would be good to add, or summer growing native grasses. But probably think about doing that after the second year, because you prime the soil and you're going to get a better result in establishing those pastures. Okay, I've got a question here from Jess. Will plantain, digit grass, rose grass, or green panic grow in dry land? Yes, it will. Plantain may be a bit limited. Digit grass and green panic, yes, they will, especially digit, and the natives will. But yep, that'll be fine. Plantain may be a problem. So you put probably lucerne in instead of plantain. Now these are mixes that I would suggest for Kerry and Grant. That a winter mix of oats, forage, brassica, turnip, tillage, radish, field peat, lupin, that can be adjusted. That depends on cost, but something like that, fair diversity, and that's designed to fix the soil and give you good feed as well. Summer multi-species mix can be things like millet and cowpea. Buckwheat, if you're in those questions that are coming from Jess, you wouldn't put buckwheat in a 500 mil rainfall, I wouldn't think. But so tillage, radish and sunflower in there as well. Now, sowing these, because you want to be organic, weeds will be a problem, especially in that winter mix. Herbicide isn't an option for you. Ploughing is possible, but will kill existing pasture and the soil ecosystem. Ploughing is very destructive, probably more destructive than a herbicide, selective herbicide anyway. But if that's the only option you have, okay, the multi-species crop will be beneficial. Now, also graze the paddock before sowing. That's a big one. Also, grazing the paddock, as well as adding manure and urine on it, also, if you graze it really hard, does stress those plants, shortens the roots, like I just said in those early slides. And certainly, however you approach it, it can be is a very good way of doing it. Now, there are other options, and these ones I'd like in an organic system. I mentioned these before: yeoman's plough or soil care renovator, and I used those same slides in the presentation before, in that last week. But either of those, the yeoman's is a far more cost-effective way of doing it, and we can get some good results with it. May not be quite as good a crop result as the renovator, but those renovators are $80,000 or $100,000 to purchase, and so now the question for a lot of people. I'm not being negative on them. I think that they for this application they can be really good. So a few options there, but those yeomans aren't that difficult to set up. And it would be good if the group or members went and had a look at Jason Hagen's property and had a look at his machine and asked him how he's been going with it. He's not that far from you, I don't think. That's Jason's machine on the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, have we got any questions on that before we go any further? I have tried to purchase cowpea in 25 kilo bags. Do you know where to purchase? Yeah, usually you can purchase cowpeas. I got some this last summer, Now, remember, cowpeas need to be in the go in the summer. It's too late to put them in now. So you've got 6 months or so to get to purchase them. I just purchased them from the local supplier. There's no, all of these seeds that I'm recommending are available at any of the rural supplies places. Grant Sims may also have a mix with cowpeas in it as well. If using herbicide, what is the plan? I'm going to address that now in the next talk. The next property. Okay, just here, Dean's just commented. This is a member of our group, but due to biosecurity issues and time constraint, hasn't been on the calls. Yeah, might be organise a visit. Might be our call. Yep, that'd be, yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess now with the virus, the visit might be difficult, I guess, possibly. Okay, but I would definitely get in touch with Jason on that, because he's close to, well, he's a member of your group, so that's even better. Ross Collier. Now I've got, I'll come back to these photos again. Now, just the property itself looks to have good ground cover and good diversity of species. The other property also, the previous one was very good ground cover on it. It was actually in pretty good condition, as this property is too. Now, the paddock has good ground cover and good species diversity, a perennial species diversity. Now, I'll just go back to that first slide. If we look at these are just photos of the paddocks. I think there's microlina in here too, in this paddock. So most of those, I think, are perennial species, and not many weeds in there. There's a flat weed in that. It's like cape weed, I think, in that right-hand corner, but I wouldn't worry about that at all. Those pastures look quite good. Most likely, all cool season winter spring growers, but there may not be a lot of summer ones in there. Okay, in regard to sowing this paddock, I didn't get a lot of information from Ross, but that paddock, because there's a lot of weeds and Ross is not worried about using a herbicide. I mean, doesn't want to use a lot, but certainly okay with using a herbicide. In this sense, paddock, because that's got a lot of perennials on there, you don't want to kill those perennials. You want to keep them alive. Graze a paddock with large mob sheep or cattle, pre-herbicide application. Spray with Basta. Now, don't use Roundup. Roundup will just kill all those perennial pastures. You want to use something that won't kill those perennial grass species. And this is actually pasture cropping. You can use gramoxone or spray seed, but I've gone away from, since I found Basta, I'm recommending it move away from gramoxone and spray seed. They're horrible things to have as herbicides to use. Basta seems to be a bit more user-friendly, if any herbicide is. And on the label, most of the rates are a lot higher than this, but I've been experimenting with different rates. And 1.3 litres per hectare with 100 litres of water, high water rate, this is per hectare, will give good knockdown on there, will control any annuals that are in there, in that paddock, and set back the perennials. Those winter ones, especially if they're something like Phalaris, they'll all recover from it. They'll recover from it later in the winter and start to compete a bit with the crop. But because of the species mix you have in there, that's something that will most likely happen. The suggestions for here, and we're looking at Ross was looking at fixing soil structure, increasing carbon, and stock feed. So oats is always the better one if you want stock feed. Oats is also very good for soil health. very strongly mycorrhizal. In other words, it'll increase mycorrhizal fungi. We got this forage brassica in there as well, which is very good stock feed. Tillage radish to fix soil structure, and turnip also. Turnip is usually quite low cost, so it's always good to have some in there. Vetch is always good, although I found it doesn't do as well on basalt soils as red, heavier soils. Field pea is also good to include good feed. It doesn't recover well after grazing. So now, in regard to this, fertiliser should be included. I had a look at the soil test, and nitrogen, well, is low, and that's related to cycling, but phosphorus, potassium, and sulphur. So everything's a bit low in there, and you would include the fertiliser in there if you want to get a reasonable result. I was surprised the potassium was low. Often potassium's okay. So now, I didn't have a lot of information from Ross in regard to whether he wanted to sow a summer mix, but I would certainly consider sowing a summer multi-species crop following that. With the species you have there, you probably have a summer feed gap. It would fill that summer feed gap and help restore the soil structure and soil health as well. So, any questions on that? No, it doesn't look like it. I don't think. Oh, wait on. Yes, there is. Should we aim to get a plant grass inventory? Yes, that's a very good question, Dean. It is important to know what species you have in your paddocks, and then to identify them yourself. If there's someone good at identifying plants, pasture species in the group, that would be good. And it is difficult from photos to really know what's there. Now, so in relation to that, Dean, I think it's a very good thing to do, because very hard to manage a paddock if you don't know what species are in there. Remember, this is different to what we're normally doing. Like, normally what we do with those paddocks is you go in and plough them up or spray them out with Roundup, kill everything that's there, sow everything, and then you've got to start all over again, and then you've got to resow the pasture. I mean, why do that and just set those pasture species back, like give them a hell of a headache, either with something like selective herbicide or with the yeomans or similar machine to create a kill zone. But you're keeping those other species in there. Why kill them when you've got good pasture? You just need to increase the species in them. So, okay, what have we got here? We've got some. What depth should you recommend sowing a pre-mix of large and small seeds? That's a good question, because it can be a problem. Basically, the simple thing is, if they're big seeds, they can be sown at 20 to 30 millimetres deep, an inch or even nearly 2 inches deep with the big seeds. So something like oats, field pea, vetch, those bigger seeds should be sown a deeper, or can be sown deeper. The small seeds like turnip, forage brassica, those really tiny seeds should not be sown deep. If you sow them deep, like at especially 2 inches, they won't get to sunlight when they germinate and try to grow before they run out of energy, and they'll die. So a way of doing that is the way I do it is I've got a separate small seed box, which is only really a pasture box on my seeder or seed drill. And because I'm direct drilling, I drop those small seeds on top of the ground, just in front of a press wheel, and they just push them in, so they're quite shallow. So, okay, if you don't have that option, You can adjust the seeds a bit. I know certainly radish is a reasonable size seed, will come up from depth. So you might start picking those bigger seeds in your mix if you haven't got that option. If people are sowing with a disc drill, they can be mixed together, because disc drills don't go very deep. An option is to just make sure all the seeds go quite shallow. That's certainly another one. How much time is needed before using herbicide and sowing a winter crop? Not very long. Certainly, generally only a couple of days is all you need. Not long at all. Sometimes I don't even wait that long. I have been a little bit wary about that BAS. So when I first started, I didn't know what the plant back period was. But so I left it for a week, but I don't think that's necessary. I haven't run into any problems with that. Certainly, gramoxone or spray seed, you could spray it an hour before. It doesn't matter too much. So, Paul Foreman is a field ecologist in our group. Well, he most likely would be, this is from Dean, would be really good to get to identify some of those species. That's it. That's great. You've got an ecologist in your group. We need more ecologists and less agronomists, I think. I shouldn't say that. But ecologists really understand what's going on when we start talking about this sort of stuff, and about species diversity and having soils functioning well. Okay. Now, also with Ross, change the farm's grazing management to a rotation to give perennial plants time to recover. That's important. As I said before, as perennial plants grow larger, they fix soil structure, cycle nutrients, and restore the soil ecosystem. I'm going over time here, but I don't think it matters too much. I'm not worried about it if no one else is. Now, this is Dean's property, and interesting, with different again. I've included, Dean's got the photo at the bottom here is just a better paddock, and that cage there is, this is a good thing to do, to record how much pasture that paddock is growing. If it's being grazed, you've got no way other than some fat animals. So to have an exclusion area like that they can't eat, at least you know how much pasture that paddock's produced. So now the paddock here, in that photo, is the one that Dean's going to work with. And apparently you put in a mix last year, which was very didn't perform very well, mainly due to the dry season, and weed pressure. The stalky stuff in there, I'm assuming, is leftover bit of this paddock is the paddock that Dean's wanting to put a multi-species crop in this year. Dean's organic and biodynamic, as you probably know. It's been grazed, and no fertiliser put on it. It's a compacted sandy loam. The species in there are ryegrass, pachyphalaris, cocksfoot, barleygrass, brome, silvergrass, erodium, and capeweed. That's fine. I mean, if there's some perennials in there, you need to leave them there, as I mentioned before. Now, those species, weed species in the barleygrass, brome, well, not the brome, but silvergrass, erodium, and capeweed are going to have an effect on a crop that you sow, or they will compete. So we need to work out a way of doing it. And we don't have a herbicide option. So what Dean is wanting to do is grow winter and summer covers to fill feed gap and restore the soil and paddock. Soil is low in phosphorus, nitrogen and carbon. The nitrogen side of it generally don't need to worry too much about nitrogen. Is more of a cycling thing. And as we fix the soils, the nitrogen will be okay. You don't have a lot of options in regard to fertilizers, although I was talking to a fellow from Victoria on the phone 2 days ago, and there is a product now available in Victoria which is worm castings made into granular form, and it's called Worm Hit, HIT. You can look that up on the internet, and it can be used as a conventional fertilizer down the tube. It might be quite good. It's certainly worth checking up on. And being in Victoria, it's probably okay. The price of it looks okay. It's about the price of conventional fertilizer. Don't know anything about it, not necessarily not promoting it or promoting anything, but it could be a good option. And certainly Nutrisoil is a good option. There's a few things out there you can use as a fertilizer, organic systems. The paddock does lack perennial pasture diversity, and the paddock lacks summer growing pasture. Now, Dean's got a grazing rotation going now, which is good. That type of grazing rotation will move things forward, no doubt about that, but we can speed it up faster as if we use some other things in conjunction with the grazing. Now, those winter and summer mixes are up there. As I've mentioned before, the lupin that I've got in that winter mix down the bottom is there as an extra legume, generally quite low cost, and it's not there for stock feed so much, but it's got a good root system on it, really cycles phosphorus well, and the summer mix down the bottom, that's a fairly safe sort of a mix for your area. Now, this is same slide I used a while ago, but it's the same approach. Because it's organic, what do? We do need to control weeds if you want to get a crop to grow, and herbicide isn't an option. Again, ploughing is possible, but we need to be aware that we are going to do some damage with ploughing. Again, graze the paddock and have a really good look at some of this other machinery. Especially if you want to be organic. As far as I know, I grow crops here without herbicides a fair bit now, and almost all of the multi-species crops that I grow, I didn't this year, but mostly I grow them without a herbicide. But I've been doing this for 25 years. I've got good ground cover and very few weeds on this property now. So you can do it over time, but you're going to get some disappointing results if you don't do something about weeds that are going to compete very strongly with the crop. And so they're the main ones that I know of that to manage weeds sort of straight away, like other than over time. Combining good grazing management with pasture cropping, that sort of stuff, will definitely get rid of weeds and produce ground cover and litter, and that'll control weeds. But it does take time. Okay, that's. I've got some questions here, or one question I've got. We had a grazing talk by Dick Richardson from Grazing Naturally. He's had a good grazing strategy. Yeah, Dick's an holistic management educator. So yes, Dick does some of the stuff different to some of the other educators, but it'll be basically it is similar to many of the other holistic management grazing people. About plant recovery time, perennial plant recovery time. Okay, we got any other questions on that? That's the end of this talk. Will driving on top of a summer crop with a tractor kill it? I'd like to sow between rows of tree crops, but then need to drive through. We're driving on top of a summer crop with a tractor kill. No, I know it won't. It won't kill it. Might flatten it a bit, but no, it won't kill it. I'd like to sow between rows of tree crops, but then need to drive through in spring or summer. Okay, no, that's all right. You shouldn't hurt it. Driving over crops generally don't hurt them too much. From Jess, before sowing summer crop, should I wait to see if the winter crop is beginning to terminate? If it isn't due to late rainfall, etc., should I hold off sowing the summer crop for a bit? You can actually. I reckon the best way to terminate a crop is to graze it. Those crops will keep growing, like things like oats or many, and even the Brassicas will keep growing up until December. And you can still graze them right up until that point. So while you can get grazing off it, I wouldn't worry too much. But I mean, you could still, even if that crop is still standing, you could sow in amongst it because it's going to shut down. So yeah, I'd graze it out and then sow. By the time October gets around, a lot of those winter species are slowing down. But you could sow a summer crop anywhere up till Christmas time, for example, up to late December. It's like any crop, the earlier you can get it in, the more food you'll get off it. We've got a lot of questions here. From John Carruthers, look forward to feedback or dialogue on our proposed small carp trial. However, don't think there was room anyway. Oh, okay, yep. Right. So here's one from Jess. What is your position on planting tree and shrub plantations for overall soil ecosystem health? I think it's a good idea. Now, you can also plant trees and shrubs in alleys. If you do that, make sure don't make a mistake of planting them too close. So you've got plenty of width between them, so then you can plant like these multi-species crops or other pastures or whatever, anything between them. That's been done in West Australia now for quite a while, and it does work well. So yes, I think it's a good thing. The overall farm ecosystem starts functioning well if you've got more shrub and tree species. Be a bit careful about trees and big trees in those alleys, that they don't start drawing too much moisture between the alleys and then affect the growth of what you're trying to grow between the alleys. And you could select the species for that. Any advice to get rid of Patterson's curse? Patterson's, I assume that's what it is, Patterson's curse. Now, Patterson's curse it's an annual growing species. Any plant that grows, say in the autumn, any weed, Patterson's curse, cakeweed, all those types of, especially those broadleaf things, but barley grass, but mostly they're growing because you're probably going into the autumn without any ground or enough ground cover. So the problem is not the autumn, but it's actually what you can grow through the summer to produce ground cover so that those weeds don't want to grow. Like those types of weeds grow on bare ground and often compacted soil. They'll often have a big root system on them, which is really good at breaking through a poor soil structure. So they get an advantage in there. They've got a root system that'll handle poor soil structure. Patterson's curse is similar. So again, you can spray it if you want to. If you don't, if you're not into spraying anything, we can use these methods we're talking about. But again, it's just growing more plants, creating ground cover. It's as much that as competition. Like we often talk about competition, but if we can create ground cover, we'll have a lot less weeds. And we know that from what happens in vegetable garden or any garden. We put mulch on gardens to stop weeds from growing, make better use of water, stops evaporation, many things. And so we can do the same thing in our paddocks by putting mulch or growing mulch and litter.
I think I received an email, or there was something about an online course that Colin was proposing or forthcoming, and I'm just wondering where Colin thought that might fit into the mix in terms of building capacity and capability.
Yeah. I'm going to be doing an online course, quite detailed one, and it's most of it has been pre-recorded, so it's very detailed on a lot of this, far more detail than we've spoken about here. But yes, that online course will be coming up in about a month, and it's one of those things that you can just continue to go back to, and just, so it's not just just totally live. There will be some live things in it, but pretty well it's pre-recorded, so you can just get that and just replay it if you want, whatever. But it is quite detailed on pasture cropping, multi-species crops, grazing, quite detailed, and grasslands and all sorts of things.
All right, so I'll sign off now. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Darren, and we'll speak soon. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.